Olá, bom dia! Bem-vindos ao segundo colóquio de estudos Vikings escandinavos e a segunda jornada de arqueologia viking, que são organizados pelo NEV, o Núcleo de Estudos Vikings Escandinavos. Essa é a nossa 12ª edição. Vamos ter muitas comunicações, conferências e o lançamento de um livro. O acesso aos vídeos do evento é livre no canal do YouTube do NEV e as sessões ficarão gravadas. Vamos à nossa programação? Às 9h da manhã de Brasília, daqui a pouquinho, teremos a conferência A Mythical Heritage, The Case of the Vikings in North America, com o professor Francesco D'Angelo. Depois, teremos a conferência From Emporium to Civitas, in Southern Scandinavia, com o professor Morten Sövsson. Às 19h de Brasília, voltamos com a sessão com o minicurso Barcos de Pedras, os memoriais megalíticos dos Vikings, com o professor Johnny Langer e a coordenação de Guilherme Galego. Amanhã, quinta-feira, dia 14, nós teremos a terceira conferência, às 9h da manhã, de Brasília, The Vikings in France, From Raids to Settlements, com o professor Jean Renaud. Às 15h de Brasília, teremos a nossa quarta conferência, The Archaeology of Ragnarok, Viking Age Response to Volcanism in Iceland, com o professor Kevin Smith. Às 19h de Brasília, teremos a nossa primeira mesa redonda com a história dos Vikings, com a coordenação de Sandro Teixeira. Nessa mesa redonda, nós teremos as comunicações Elevados do Inferno aos Céus, a revitalização historiográfica dos Vikings pacíficos, de Caio de Amorim Fel, Os Variags Mártires da Rus, ou Cristianismos na Rota dos Nórdicos a Bizâncio, de Leandro César Santana Neves, e Islendingabok, a crônica islandesa como história de poder, família e cristianização, de Lucas Soares Pinto. Na sexta-feira, o último dia da conferência, teremos a sessão de comunicações 1, coordenada por Thaís Matos Barbosa, e depois teremos a sessão de comunicação 2, que vai das 10h30 às 12h. Depois, a segunda mesa redonda, que acontece a partir das 14h, 14h, com o tema de runas e pedras rúnicas da era viking, com a coordenação de Monice Araújo Silva. E teremos a palestra Comunicação, o cotidiano medieval em runas, de Hélio Pires, a comemoração em crisis, o vocabulário de luta em las piedras rúnicas, de Nicolás Jaramillo, e a expedição de Ingvar, Pedras Rúnicas, Saga e História, de Leandro Vilar de Oliveira. Depois voltamos às 17h com a oficina Arqueologia Experimental da Era Viking, Teoria e Prática, sob coordenação de André de Oliveira, e quem vai ministrar é a doutora Luciana de Campos. Logo após essa oficina, teremos o lançamento do livro, que é uma grande novidade no nosso colóquio, e é o livro da doutora Luciana de Campos, chamado O Campo de Centáureas, Cenas da Vida na Dinamarca Viking, que é um romance, é uma ficção inspirada em histórias nórdicas, que tem como protagonista um personagem feminino, que é a Olga. Mais detalhes vocês saberão no lançamento do livro. E, na sexta-feira, às 19h30, teremos a terceira sessão de comunicações coordenada por Glésia Alves de Mello. O nosso encerramento será com o professor Johnny Langer, que é o nosso coordenador do NEV, Núcleo de Estudos Vikings Escandinavos, e será às 21h30 da sexta-feira. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Os inscritos receberão um link para acesso dos certificados, então não se preocupem, todos vão receber o link para acessar os certificados. E temos também uma grande e boa notícia. A revista Scândia, número 7, já está disponível para leitura, já foi publicada e está disponível no site da revista, que é a Scândia Journal of Medieval Norse Studies. Então, já está lá, está muito bonita. Nós temos um editorial, como sempre, com bons artigos, com boas sínteses. E nessa edição nós temos uma entrevista com o Henrique Bernardo de Santos sobre os estudos nórdicos em língua espanhola. Então, daqui a pouquinho, às 9 horas da manhã de Brasília, nós voltaremos com a conferência do doutor Francesco D'Angelo, que tem como título... Só um momento. A Mythical Heritage, The Case of the Vikings in North America. Bem-vindos e até daqui a pouco. Gente, eu falei com o microfone desligado. Peço desculpas. Agora sim o som vai sair. Nós tivemos um pequeno problema com o fuso horário do Brasil e também de Roma, porque na Europa o horário de inverno começou semana passada e a hora muda em 1 hora. Então tivemos esse pequeno problema com o fuso horário, pedimos imensas desculpas pelo atraso e até às 10 horas de Brasília o professor estará conosco para a conferência The Case of the Vikings in North America. Então, até às 10 horas estaremos com o professor Francesco D'Angelo. E, mais uma vez, pedimos desculpas e agradecemos a vossa presença. Obrigada. Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Professor Francesco D'Angelo, and welcome. I'm here with Professor Dr. Francesco D'Angelo, with his researcher in Universidade della Sapienza di Roma, and he's going to present to us the conference, A Mythical Heritage, the Case of the Vikings in North America, at our 12th Conference of Viking and Scandinavian Studies. Dr. Francesco, thank you very much for your presence. And now I pass the floor to you.
Good morning, Andrea. Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for your invitation to participate in this conference. So I will start saying I'm not an archaeologist, but I am an historian, a medievalist. But in my talk, I am going to deal with different disciplines. History, archaeology, fake archaeology, philology, even runology. Now, I would like to start my speech with talking about recent events that most of us probably remember well. I'm talking about the assault on the U.S. Capitol on January the 6th in 2021. And the images of that assault, and particularly the pictures of the man that was renamed the shaman, with his body covered in tattoos inspired by Norse mythology, like the Yggdrasil tree and the Mjolnir hammer, have once again brought to us the attention to the political use of symbols related to medieval Scandinavia, often exploited by the far right, the alt-right, and white supremacist supporters. Despite this current relevance, this phenomenon has its roots in 19th century historical and philological studies of a romantic and nationalist bent, which, in promoting the idea of the superiority of the Germanic peoples including the Nordic peoples, also emphasized their supposed racial purity. In this view, later adopted by Nazism in Germany, Scandinavia represented the true cradle of Germanism, where it was able to remain pure both culturally and racially. Thus, the Germanic past, idealized and essentially reinvented, has taken on an identity value for supremacists, who still use it to justify their claims of superiority. Well, but supremacist theories are the ultimate sprouts of a long-standing tradition going back to the 19th century, a tradition that still persists in some areas of the United States. That are of the tradition of a supposed Viking heritage or identity, which from the time of the Norse voyages to North America in the Middle Ages has supposedly been passed down to the Americans of today. This theory rests and still rests on two different foundations, one cultural and ideological, and the other historical. The first foundation, the first root is the Viking myth, which arose in Europe in the 19th century as a part of the re-evaluation and reinterpretation of the Middle Ages by the Romantic movement, often driven by nationalist motivations. The symbolic starting point of this myth can be considered the poem Vikingen, the Viking, published in 1811 by Erik Gustav Geyer, a Swedish writer, historian, musician, and professor at Uppsala University, as well as one of the founders of the Judiska Förbundet, that is the Gothic Society in Stockholm, a patriotic literary circle whose goal was to revive the spirit of the Goths, a name that was used at that time to refer to the inhabitants of ancient Sweden, on the basis of the similarity between the name Goths and the name of the region Götaland. Thanks to Geyer and his poem, published in the journal Iduna, the word Viking, which for centuries had remained in use almost exclusively in Icelandic with its original meaning of pirate, became of common use in other Scandinavian and European languages, now being employed as a synonym for Scandinavian. In 1825, the work Frithiof's Saga, composed by another Swede, Esaias Tegnér, and loosely inspired by a 14th century legendary saga, further helped consolidate this heroic image of the Vikings, who were presented in a glorious light. Within a few years, the fascination with these figures spread to other European countries, especially to Victorian England, where Norse sagas were translated into English for the first time, and the Viking revival became a true trend. The Nordic warriors became the protagonists of novels, poems, and dramas, not only as pirates, but also as merchants, adventurers, mercenaries, colonists, explorers, and so on, and even proto-democrats. In England, as in Scandinavia and in Germany, Romanticism, which exalted the primacy of sentiment, spirituality, emotion, and the sublime, saw in the ancient Norsemen as wild, free, irrational, pure, because they had seemingly never been tamed or corrupted by the classical or the Christian civilization, Christian Catholic civilization, in this view. Thus, the Vikings were the perfect embodiment of romantic values, as well as the ancestors from whom to claim such a noble heritage. In this cultural climate, the myth of the Vikings' versatility was born, transforming him from a simple pirate into an individual capable and able of adapting to any situation and context, whether in war or in peace. So the Viking became a figure that combines the allure of the anti-hero and the rogue with the virtues and the noble spirit of the knight, so forming an unusual hybrid with both dark and heroic traits. But the second root of this behind this myth consists were the stories from two 13th century Icelandic sagas, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, which recount the voyages and the explorations that between the 10th and the 11th centuries led the Norsemen to discover and then colonize the Atlantic islands and lands previously unknown to the Europeans. This is especially the case with the journey of Eric the Red, a Norwegian landowner who was exiled from Norway for murder from his homeland, and then from Iceland for the same reason. So in 985 or 986, Eric set sail from Iceland. After several days of navigation, Eric landed on a land he named Greenland in Norse, in Old Norse. That is the Greenland, a name intended to entice other Icelanders to join him in the new colony. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, in around 986, the Icelandic merchant Bjarni Eriolfsson, blown of course by the winds while trying to reach Greenland, sighted the coast of an unknown land. Realizing it was not Greenland, Bjarni set sail again, and after 5 days on navigation, finally spotted Greenland and the Greenland shores. When the news of these sightings spread in Greenland, Leif, the son of Eric the Red, decided to retrace Bjarni's route in an attempt to explore the land Bjarni had glimpsed to the west. To that end, Leif bought Bjarni's ship and hired his crew, setting off with them in the year 1000. After several days of navigation, Leif and his men first landed on a mountainous and ice-covered land, which Leif named Helluland, the land of the flat rocks, maybe the Baffin Island in today Canada. Then he landed in a forested region they called Markland, the land of the forest, probably Labrador. And finally, they reached a much richer and more fertile land further south, a land which Leif named Vinland, maybe the land of wine, probably in today Newfoundland, due to the presence of wild grapevines. But we must say that the meaning of Vinland is still disputed, with some scholars who translate it as the land of grass or the land of meadows. So here in Vinland, the Greenlanders stayed for several months, building wooden houses and exploring the area until in the spring of the following year they set sail again and returned to Greenland. At this point, we should point out that in the saga of Eric the Red, the story of the discovery of these new lands is slightly different, with Leif and not Bjarni playing the role of the first Norseman who spotted the new lands. In the following years, these explorations were followed by real attempts to settle Vinland. Of all of them, the most ambitious and organized was the attempt made by the Icelander Thorfinn Karlsefni, who set sail around 1025 with his wife and 64 other would-be colonists. Having reached Vinland, Thorfinn landed at the old settlement of Leif Erikson, remaining there for 3 years. During that time, his wife Gudrid gave birth to their son Snorri, who was thus the first European born on American soil. Soon after, however, the apparently idyllic situation was disturbed by the outbreak of conflicts with the natives, who the Scandinavians called Skrællingar, maybe with the meaning of wretches. Eventually, as the continued hostility of the Skrællingar made it too dangerous to remain in Vinland, Thorfinn and the other settlers decided to return home. Despite the failure of Thorfinn Karlsefni, until the mid 14th century, there were still occasional Greenlandic expeditions to the new lands, primarily aimed at collecting timber, a resource of which Greenland was chronically lacking. This is a view of this North expedition in North America and the settlement they founded in Greenland and in the North American coast. So, starting from the first half of the 19th century, historians, antiquarians, and scholars began searching for archaeological evidence that could confirm the saga's accounts about Vinland. To this end, in the 1830s, the Danish scholar Carl Christian Raffner wrote to various historical societies in the United States, asking them to point out or send him information about objects, structures, or inscriptions of possible Scandinavian origin. In 1857, the results of this investigation were published by Raffner in the book Antiquitates Americanae, American Antiquities or Northern Writers of Pre-Columbian Events in America. Among the many reports received by Raffner, many of which were about alleged Viking weapons, 3 immediately gained wide popularity as Scandinavian antiquities. The first was the so-called Viking Tower of Newport in Rhode Island. The second was the Dighton Rock at Berkeley in Massachusetts. And the third, the so-called Skeleton in Armor of Fall River in Massachusetts. So, the Newport Tower is the remains of a round stone building of about 8 meters high. This tower was pointed out by many scholars, including the Swede Oscar Montelius, as an authentic Norse structure from the 12th century, due to its architectural design resembling some medieval churches visible in Scandinavia. In 1928, the connection between the Newport Tower and the Vikings was further popularized by the movie The Viking. The first color feature film on the Vikings that narrates with horned or winged helmets and glaring anachronism like an Amazonian parrot in a Viking camp. So this movie, this film narrates the story of Leif Erikson and the discovery of Vinland. After various adventures, Leif Erikson comes ashore in the New World, dramatically planting a huge crucifix on the beach, a scene clearly borrowed from the iconic imagery of Columbus landing in 1492. So this is the final scene of the Viking movie, with Leif Erikson planting this huge crucifix on the beach. Following this, in the movie, Leif and his men encountered the natives and offered them a crucifix as a sign of peace. Then oversees the construction of a stone tower, which in the film is clearly identified as the Newport Tower. The final intertitle in the movie tells us that no one knows what happened to this little Viking colony, but that the watchtower still stands today in Newport, in Rhode Island. As that final intertitle slowly fades, the USA national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, can be heard playing fiercely softly and then swelling to a full choral crescendo in the background. However, the interpretation of the tower as a Viking artifact did not hold up to further analysis. The tower is indeed mentioned by the English governor Benedict Arnold, who referred to it in his will in 1675 and called it my stone mill, while the style and construction techniques are identical to those of other colonial buildings constructed in New England during the 17th century. The tower, therefore, could not date back early than 1640 or 1650. Moreover, there are some other uncontrovertible data against the Viking theory. First of all, there are no records of the structure predating the time of Benedict Arnold, while similar fortifications appear throughout New England during the early years of English settlement. Particularly significant are the results of excavation conducted in the post-war period on behalf of the Peabody Museum of Harvard University. Indeed, objects dating undeniably to the colonial period were found in the foundations of the building, such as pieces of brick and plaster, porcelain, glass, and even a flintstone used to create the spark necessary for firing a musket. All these elements indicate that the tower could not have been built before the second half of the 17th century. This conclusion was later confirmed by a radiocarbon test performed on a sample of mortar taken from the building's walls. The analysis revealed that the mortar solidified in around 1680, a dating consistent with that provided by the archaeologists. The second Viking artifact that Rafn focused his attention on was the Dagiton Rock, situated in Berkeley, Massachusetts, and known since the colonial period. The rock, you can see the rock in the slide. The rock is noted for its petroglyphs of uncertain origin, which, according to Rafn, were a mixture of runes and Latin letters, translated by Rafn as follows. This is the Rafn translation. Thorfinn and his 151 companions took possession of this land. Thus, the inscription in this understanding represented a witness of the arrival of Thorfinn Karlsefni and his men in the 11th century. And the notion of Thorfinn and his companions taking possession of this land became an assertion of Norse priority over all other Europeans. The carving of the petroglyphs, however, is today attributed to the indigenous people of North America, probably Algonquians. Another report received by Rafn regarded the so-called skeleton in armor, discovered in 1831 in Fall River, Massachusetts, along with metal, bark, and cloth artifacts. The skeleton was subsequently destroyed in a fire in 1843. After its discovery, several identities had been proposed for the skeleton, among them a Phoenician, Carthaginian, Egyptian, even a Templar. Rafn, for his part, declared it to be a Norse warrior, and going on to proclaim that the fine spot on Fall River was in Leifsbudir, the settlement of Leif Erikson in Finland. Some years later, in 1838, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was an enthusiastic subscriber to the white supremacist strand in 19th century thought, inspected the skeleton, agreeing that it was Norse, and in 1841 he published the poem The Skeleton in Armor, in which Longfellow helped promulgate the association between the local landmarks and the Vinland myth by connecting this alleged Norse skeleton with the Newport Tower. Indeed, in the poem, the warrior built the tower for his stolen bride, whom he then buries beneath the tower after she dies. Despite this elaborated reconstruction, today the skeleton is correctly recognized as a mid-17th century Native American burial. So let's see now the beginning of the first edition of this Viking heritage in North America. As we have just seen, the earliest area in which evidence of the Viking presence was found was New England, where Rafn's book sent amateur archaeologists into the field in search of further evidence to corroborate the textual hypothesis of a sustained Norse settlement. The region's economic and cultural stature was diminishing during this period, and locating the first European landfall and settlement on their very doorstep flattered the bruised egos of many New Englanders. Among the artifacts of alleged Scandinavian origin or provenance, many were weapons which, however, have proven to be of modern manufacture. For example, axes or hatchets made by American lumberjacks, passed off as Viking axes, or miniature halberds initially presented as Viking ceremonial weapons, and only to later reveal their true nature as tobacco knives distributed by the American Tobacco Company in the late 19th century to promote their quality of battle axe tobacco. Other weapons were indeed of medieval origin, but they had been brought to America in more recent time. But what was the reason behind the huge popularity of the Viking myth in 19th century New England? Well, behind the fascination with the Vikings, there was the conflation of the Anglo-Saxon and the Norse, which had begun in the 17th century when authors like Robert Molesworth imagined a past where the people of England, Germany, and Scandinavia enjoyed a commonality of freedom denied to Mediterranean people. Lord Molesworth thought in terms of people and not races. In the course of the next century, however, there was a gradual shift towards racial distinctions. The various strands of the Germanic peoples were united in England, and in the 19th century, the idea arose of the Anglo-Saxon people as the most distinguished branch of the supreme race. A racial narrative that, by our 21st century standards, is clearly repugnant. In this view, the Northmen became the forerunners of the English colonists and prepared the American soil for the subsequent conquest. In this period, similar assumptions appear in historical writings, such that of Joshua Toulmin Smith. He was a British lawyer and historian who in 1839 published the book The Northmen in New England. Toulmin Smith's book illustrates the willful racist fantasy fueling some such reinscriptions of Native American artifacts. According to him, in fact, New England may be said to have become a classic ground since the discovery of the Northmen have become generally known. The Vikings, Smith went on, discovered and explored the very same shores where a new race of Anglo-Saxon blood has fixed his habitation and made once a savage and barbarous America assume an important station in the history of the world. Although he clearly implies that Native Americans had rendered the continent savage and barbarous, Smith does not evoke their physical presence in his statement, thus facilitating an uninterrupted imaginative association between the white Vikings and the white Anglo-Americans. Another example of this kind of thought is the book of Benjamin Franklin da Costa, The Pre-Columbian Discovery of America by the Northmen, published in 1868. In the preface, the author exhorts the reader to remember that in vindicating the Northmen, we honor those who not only gave us the first knowledge possessed of the American continent, but to whom we are indebted for much beside that we esteem valuable. In reality, we fable in great measure when we speak of our Saxon inheritance. It is rather from the Northmen that we have derived our vital energy, our freedom of thought, and in a measure that we do not yet suspect, our strength of speech. These words, this passage, equivocates between a biological inheritance and a cultural inheritance, possibly because of da Costa's Mediterranean ancestry leads him to nudge the argument towards the cultural, so that it can be part of this we that shares the inheritance. But the very prominent advocate of New England settlement was Rasmus Andersson. He was a son of a Scandinavian immigrants and the first head of Scandinavian studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In Andersson's America Not Discovered by Columbus, first published in 1874, he was responsible for popularizing the idea that the Norse were the first Europeans to reach America, and that they subsequently visited America for centuries. In his book, Andersson, in fact, rewrote the founding myth of the American nation to give a central role to Scandinavian immigrants in America. The villain of the sagas, Andersson declared, was centered on Narragansett Bay, in what is now Rhode Island and Massachusetts. The artifacts at the heart of his argument were the above-mentioned inscription on Dayton Rock and the Newport Tower. It is worth noting here that Andersson's lobbying led in 1929 to the proclamation of Leif Erikson Day in Wisconsin. The observance of this day, of Leif Erikson Day, then spread to other states, and in 1964 the Congress authorized the President Lyndon Johnson to proclaim the 9th of October as Leif Erikson Day. In Andersson's view, the spirit of the Norsemen still survives in the bosom of Englishmen, Americans and Scandinavians, extending their commerce, taking bold positions against tyranny, and producing wonderful internal improvements in their countries. Also, in his view, the Norse discovery of America, far from being inconsequential, led to the creation of all that was good in the character of the modern American. His notion that Scandinavian and English immigrants descended from the same stock was an important mechanism for placing Scandinavian immigrants at the heart of a country dominated by citizens of English ancestry. Above all, in their non-violent interactions with the natives, the Vikings proved to be better than the European successors. In Andersson's account, the discovery of America did not begin with Columbus and did not end in a genocide. On the contrary, the Norsemen, and so the Europeans, were the real victims. Andersson wrote, "The Norsemen had no firearms, and their higher culture could not defend them against the swarms of savages that attacked them." Furthermore, Andersson wrote, "As Christians, the Norsemen prepared New England for the arrival of the Puritans, although in reality, we should say, the Norsemen were just as Catholic as Columbus." In Andersson's view, the blood of the Christian Thorvald Eriksson, who was killed by the natives according to the two villain sagas, so his blood had sanctified New England and consecrated America as a Christian land. In summary, the Viking myth forged in 19th century New England insisted on the cultural heritage passed from the North to the Anglo-Americans. According to this theory, these Norsemen were different from the Vikings who arrived on the coast of Europe. because they were not marauders and raiders, but adventurous explorers with an independent mindset. The result of this view, that was political, a view that was political, religious, and social at once, was the justification of the occupation of Native American land. The first two occupants of New England had been Leif Erikson and his Norsemen, of whom the Anglo-Americans were heirs, and not the natives. The second tradition, which arose in North America, is that of the Midwest. So, the story of the Viking discovery of America gained a new momentum from the cultural climate of the late 19th century, when new immigrants arrived in the USA. They were Scandinavians, but also Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, Poles, and Slavs. The Americans of English or German origin, feeling threatened by these newcomers, sought to distinguish themselves from the other ethnic group. Moreover, the Viking discovery was also celebrated coinciding with the anniversary of the discovery of America in 1892. The following year, the World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, celebrated the 4th centenary of Columbus' arrival in America. The fair included 3 replicas of Columbus caravels, but another star of the show was the Viking, a Viking ship reconstructed on the basis of the ship unearthed in 1880 at Gokstad in Norway. In this social and cultural context, the celebration of Leif Erikson was meant to reduce Columbus' importance and identify the USA, the United States, rather than the West Indies, as the point zero of the European presence in America. It was a reaction against the Catholic and the Italian Columbus during a time marked by a massive emigration from Italy and Spain. This was also the context of the discovery of probably the most famous and at the same time the most contested of all the artifacts presented to prove the Scandinavian presence in the United States. I'm talking about the Kensington runestone, described by Professor Eric Wahlgren as a rallying cry for American exponents of pan-Vikingism. This stone was discovered in 1898 by a Swedish immigrant farmer, Olaf Åman, who found it tangled among the roots of a tree in a field and brought it to the nearby village of Kensington in Douglas County, in Minnesota. A village inhabited by a community of Scandinavian immigrants. There, the marks on the stone were recognized as runes, and after being copied, they were submitted to various professors and experts in Norse antiquities, who, however, considered the inscription a modern forgery. The stone was thus forgotten for about a decade, until it caught the attention of Hjalmar Holland, a Norwegian lawyer and writer who had emigrated in the United States, and here in the United States, where he was a student of Rasmus Andersson. Convinced of the inscription's authenticity, in 1907, he purchased the stone and had it translated. The meaning of those runes is as follows, according to the translation. Eight Swedes and 22 Norwegians on exploration journey from Vinland westward. We had camp by two rocky islets, 1 day's journey north from this zone. We were out and fished 1 day. After we came home, we found 10 men red with blood and dead. Ave Virgo Maria, save from evil. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships, 40 days journey from this land, year 1362. Around this description, Holland constructed an elaborated pseudo-historical narrative, according to which the Norwegian King Magnus Eriksson in 1354 had sent an expedition, a pre-Columbian crusade, as Holland called it, to search for a group of lost Greenlandic settlers who had abandoned the Christian faith. After wandering for a long time in Vinland, that is in North America in this view, the Norwegians were allegedly attacked by hostile natives near a lake in what is now today Minnesota. The survivors of the massacre are said to have erected a runestone as a memorial for their fallen companions, invoking the protection of the Virgin Mary. Thanks to Holland's passionate defense, this description and the story associated with it was long considered authentic by many North American scholars, to the point that the stone was even displayed at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington between 1948 and 1949, where Dr. Matthew Sterling, the director of the American Bureau of Ethnology, called it one of the most extraordinary discoveries in North American archaeology. After its return to the state of Minnesota, the runestone was placed in a museum specifically built for it, the Runestone Memorial Park in Alexandria, where it remains the main attraction to this day. In the version shaped and propagated by Holland, the Kensington stone becomes a memorial to the first massacre of American history, with the fearless and faithful Scandinavians depicted as the first martyrs, slaughtered by the savage and pagan Indians. Beyond being innocent victims of the Indians' fury, Holland portrayed the Norwegian explorers as morally superior to Columbus and his men. While the latter arrived in the Americas to plunder gold and riches to bring back to Spain, the Scandinavians, in both the medieval period and in the 19th century, were peaceful Christian settlers who were not seeking economic profit, but obeying a divine command to civilize the wild nature of North America. The story, so crafted by Holland, quickly gained widespread acceptance among the Swedish and Norwegian immigrants in Minnesota, who saw the Kensington stone as a monument to the sacrifice of their ancestors and a primordial claim to the land that legitimized the subsequent white conquest. Later, as the Scandinavian American community fully integrated, the stone became a means of self-celebration and ethnic pride for the whole community. Meanwhile, the rest of the white community in Minnesota viewed the Vikings of Kensington as the first white martyrs of the West, and their encounter with the Skrællingar was seen as a prefiguration of the conflict between the pioneers and the Dakota Indians in the 19th century. For many Americans, Holland's story also allowed them to finally reconcile with their past, in which their ancestors often appeared as perpetrators and persecutors against indigenous people. Now, instead, it was the whites who were cast in the role of the victims. Despite Holland's grand claims, both the runestone and its inscription present a series of issues that from the very beginning led most runologists, especially those from Scandinavia and Germany, to consider it a forgery. First of all, the circumstances surrounding its discovery were marked by conflicting and unclear accounts, both regarding the date and the exact location where the stone was found. Additionally, the content of the inscription has raised many doubts, as it refers to a supposed expedition that is not corroborated by any medieval sources, and which would have taken place a century after the Viking
Olá, pedimos desculpa por esse pequeno problema na plataforma e já voltamos com o professor Francesco D'Angelo. Francesco, we are so sorry. Thank you for the patience. And I refer to you again.
Oh, don't worry, Andrea. It sometimes happens with the platform, so no problem.
Thank you.
So I was arrived at this point at the Kensington Stone. So I was saying that the version, the story propagated by Holland, in the story propagated by Holland, the Kensington Stone becomes a memorial to the first massacre of North America in North American history, with the fearless and the faithful Scandinavians depicted as the first martyrs, brutally slaughtered by the savage, hostile, and pagan Indians. Beyond being innocent victims of the Indians' fury, Holland portrayed the portrayed the Norwegian explorers as morally superior to Columbus and his men, because while the latter arrived in the Americas to plunder gold and riches to bring back to Spain, on the other side, the Scandinavians, in both the medieval period and in the 19th century, were peaceful Christian settlers who were not seeking economic profit, but obeying a divine command to civilize North America. The story crafted by Holland quickly gained widespread acceptance among the Swedish and the Norwegian immigrants in Minnesota, who saw the Kensington Stone as a monument to the sacrifice of their ancestors and a primordial claim to the land that legitimized the subsequent white conquest. Later, as the Scandinavian American community fully integrated, the stone became a means of self celebration and ethnic pride for the Minnesota community. Meanwhile, the rest of the white community in Minnesota viewed the Vikings of Kensington as the first white martyrs of the West, and their encounter with the Skrællingar was seen as a prefiguration of the conflict between the pioneers and the Dakota Indians in the 19th century. For many Americans, Holland's story also allowed them to finally reconcile with their past, in which their ancestors often appeared as perpetrators against the indigenous peoples. Now, thanks to Holland's story, it was the white men who were cast in the role of victims. Despite Holland's grand claims, both the runestone and its inscription present a series of problems that from the very beginning led most runologists, especially the Scandinavian and Germanic runologists, to consider it a forgery. First of all, the circumstances surrounding its discovery were marked by conflicting and unclear accounts, both regarding the date and the exact location where it was found. Additionally, the content of the inscription has raised many doubts, as it refers to a supposed expedition that is not corroborated by any medieval sources, and which would have taken place centuries after the Viking Age had ended. Moreover, the supporters of the stone's authenticity have been unable to identify any viable route from the coast that could have led the Scandinavian ships so far into the heartland of the continent. But the greatest concerns arise from the grammar and the vocabulary of the runestone, which resemble the Norwegian-Swedish dialect spoken by the immigrants in Minnesota. For instance, the inscription includes unusual words for such as dead, apparently derived from the English dead, and the term optagelsefart, meaning exploration voyage, which is unknown in medieval Scandinavian languages, but is attested in a similar form in modern Danish and Norwegian. Equally suspicious is the use of Arabic numerals for dating rather than Roman numerals, as is observed in medieval runic inscription. The most compelling evidence of its forgery lies in the numerous contemporary documents presented as copies of the inscription. Upon closer examination, these documents turned out to be experimental variants, preliminary drafts, created by someone intending to promote the hoax. In short, all these documents predate the actual inscription, meaning it cannot be older than the late 19th century. As for the forger's identity, all the clues point to the man who discovered the Kensington stone, the Swedish immigrant Olof Homan. Despite the severe blows dealt to the myth of the Kensington stone by linguistics, history, and archaeology, the enthusiasm generated by its discovery in the United States led to a wave of further discoveries. Dozens of inscriptions and objects were examined and checked, but ultimately all were judged to be of recent origin and fabrication. The only exception so far seems to be the so-called main penny, a tiny silver coin discovered by two amateur archaeologists at Naskeg Point, an Amerindian site on the coast of Maine, on August of 1957. The coin, which was partially damaged, had a hole near the edge, indicating that it was used as a pendant rather than as a means of payment, and at the time it was lost. Initially thought to be an English coin from the 12th century, nothing was known about the penny until 1972, when it was donated by its discoverers to the Maine State Museum in Augusta. There it remained virtually forgotten until 1978, when it was casually noticed by a numismatist, Peter Seeby, who correctly identified it as a Norwegian coin from the time of King Olaf the Quiet, that is from the end of the 11th century. In the hope of finding other Viking artifacts through which definitively identify the Vinland of the sagas with Maine and New England in general, extensive excavations were carried out in the area of the discovery, but this did not yield the expected results. Nevertheless, there is little doubt among scholars regarding the antiquity of the coin, a genuine medieval object, and the authenticity of the discovery, and there are no doubts about the authenticity of the discovery. Given the rarity of this particular type of coin, found only in archaeological contexts in Northern Europe, practically unavailable outside the museums, it is very unlikely that the main penny could have been used for a fraud or a forgery. But how could it have arrived so far south on the eastern coast of North America? This is the question. In an attempt to solve this mystery, archaeologists conducted investigation in Naskeg Point settlement, which has been dated to the 13th century through radiocarbon analysis. So more than 100 years after the minting of the penny. The site also yielded several common artifacts among the Inuits or Eskimos, who at that time were located much further north, in what are now the Canadian territories of Nova Scotia and Labrador. Since during the Middle Ages, the Inuit often had direct, although not always peaceful, contacts with the Scandinavian in Greenland, it is possible that between the 12th and the 13th centuries, the coin, now used as an ornament, passed first from the Greenlanders to the Inuit, and then from the Inuit to the Native Americans in Maine. Regardless of how things unfolded, most scholars today agree that the main penny is the only certain artifact of Scandinavian origin found so far in the United States. While the debate over the Kensington runestone was still stirring the academic world, in 1961, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Steen, began an excavation campaign on the island of Newfoundland in the hope to find further evidence of Leif Erikson presence. Thus, finally, they identify, in the hope of finally identifying the land of Vinland. The chosen location was Lens aux Meadows, a corruption of the French Lens aux Méduses, or the Jellyfish Bay, where the remains of several houses were visible. The excavations, which lasted for 7 years, uncovered the ruins of 8 buildings, including a forge, a latrine, several boat shelters, and so on. All the buildings were constructed in the same manner, with turf walls and roofs supported by wooden frames, a typical technique of Iceland and Greenland around the year 1000. This timeline was confirmed by radiocarbon dating, which placed the site between roughly 975 and 1020. Among the artifacts found, there were woodworking scraps, primarily from ships repairs, and a quantity of bog iron, a material unknown to the Native Americans. Near one of the houses, a bronze pin was with a ringed head, commonly used during the Viking Age to fasten clocks, was discovered, along with a whetstone for sharpening metal tools. These findings strongly suggest a Scandinavian presence at the site around the time described in the Norse sagas. The results of the excavation were then published by Anne Steen in 1977 in the book The Discovery of a Norse Settlement in America. Today, scholars agree that the remains at Lens aux Meadows are of unmistakably Scandinavian origin. This means that the site is the only known European settlement in the Americas predating the arrival of Columbus. Due to its importance, the site was designated as a National Historic Site by Canada and declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1978. However, the question remains open regarding the identification of Lens aux Meadows with the settlement founded by Leif Erikson. an identification strongly supported by archaeologist Birgitta Wallace. If this were the case, Lens Aumidos would have been merely a base camp, and Newfoundland just a small part of Vinland, because the island is located too far north for wild grapes to grow. Wild grapes, a plant whose presence, according to the sagas, was linked to the very name of Vinland. During the 1960s, while Ingstad and Steen were excavating at the Lance Aumido site, the question of Norse voyages gained momentum also in Canada, where the integration of the Icelandic immigrants brought to the gradual disappearing of their native language, replaced by English, and the formation of fluid identities. It is perhaps unsurprising then that the Viking cause was resurrected at exactly this point with the book of Tryggvi Olesson, the book entitled Early Voyages and Northern Approaches, published in 1963. Even though he did not make explicit reference to Lance Aumidos, what Olesson wrote was indeed an immigrant historiography. For just as Anderson had identified Rasmus Anderson had identified history as a suitable vector for the improvement of his group's status in the New World, so too did Olesson. Just as Anderson had chosen the imagined Germanic past as a fertile ground for compromise between Norwegians and the New Englanders, Olesson too chose compromise as his strategy, setting his narrative in terms that would appeal to the mid-20th century Canadian elites. Most importantly, Olesson appealed to the Canadians' ongoing fascination with the North, proposing a theory of Viking exploration that recast the discovery of America as the discovery of the Canadian Arctic, arguing that the medieval Norsemen, following the same westward movement ascribed them by Holland, had moved from Greenland to Baffin Island and Labrador. Olesson provided the Canadians with an alternative history of both the Columbian conquest and the American accounts of Viking discovery. Although Olesson did not deny the possibility of Vikings landing in New England, he argued that their only certifiable New World landfall was not in the United States, but in Canada. In Olesson's account, then, these voyages formed the prehistory of the Canadian Arctic. Describing the period of Icelandic discovery and contact as the medieval phase of Canadian history, Olesson implied that Canada preceded America. So Olesson placed the Icelandic Canadians at the very center of the social order as the descendants of the people who literally had put Canada on the map. This meant that the only way to make Icelanders fit in the Canadian context was to figure them as forefathers in a master narrative whose endpoint was the coming together of the British and the French in an integrated European-linked nation-state. Olesson's book was extremely controversial and criticized, especially because of his theory that the Thule culture, the predecessor of the Inuit, was the result of intermarriage and cultural fusions between the Norse settlers from Greenland and the Arctic inhabitants. In support of this thesis, Olesson relied on his interpretation of archaeological evidence, such as the structure of stone shelters in Eastern Arctic, which he saw as similar to Icelandic structure. He also relied on Norse sagas, which have several descriptions of encounters between Norse and Inuit, and according to Olesson, this would explain the gradual disappearance of the Norse settlements in Greenland. In his view, they did not simply disappear, Rather, the Norse gradually fused with the Dorset peoples of the High Arctic. But, as I just said, his theory attracted considerable critical reviews. Another great issue. Between authentic discoveries and blatant forgeries, the academic debate over the Norse voyages to America was in the 1950s and 1960s was highly charged, drawing the attention of the general public. It was in this context that on October 11, 1965, on the eve of the anniversary of Columbus' discovery of America, Yale University revealed to the world the existence of a previously unknown map that apparently showed the location of Vinland and dated back to 50 years before Columbus' departure from Spain. The map was bound to a codex alongside an otherwise unknown treatise, the Tartar Relation, a Historia Tartarorum, which detailed the mission to Mongolia by the Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carmine. The codex originally also contained part of Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Historiale, which was later separated from the rest of the volume. Both the manuscript and the handwriting of the map and the Tartar relation suggest the early 15th century as a plausible date, and Central Europe as its likely place of origin. What makes the map extraordinary is its content, because it depicts the world as known in the Middle Ages and includes Greenland and Vinland, then the North American territories discovered by the Norse. Equally remarkable are the Latin inscription accompanying these lands. So this is the Vinland map. Next to the drawings of Iceland and Greenland, a short legend reads, Island of Vinland discovered by Bjarni and Leif in company, while a longer inscription appears above Vinland. God willed that after a long journey from Greenland to the farthest remaining parts of the Western Ocean Sea, the companions Bjarni and Leif Erikson, sailing south through the ice, discovered a new land, which was very rich and which even had wine. They called it Vinland Island. Eric, Bishop of Greenland and the neighboring regions, and legate of the Apostolic See, in this truly vast and rich land, arrived in the name of the Almighty God in the last year of the reign of Pope Paschal. Eric stayed some time in summer and in winter before returning to Greenland, and later proceeding southward in obedience to God's will. These words clearly refer to the voyages undertaken by Bjarni Eriksson and Leif Erikson, and also mentions a certain Bishop Erik, likely the same one who, according to the 14th century Icelandic annals, set out in 1121 to search for Vinland and never returned. If authentic, the Vinland map would not only serve as a further evidence of the Viking arrival in America, but more importantly, it would suggest that their ventures were well known to Columbus when he organized this expedition. However, from the outset, many experts expressed skepticism about the document, which shows several questionable elements, starting with its unverifiable provenance. Yale University had purchased the manuscript from a significant sum from Lawrence Witten, an American rare book dealer, who had acquired it in 1957 from the Italian Enzo Ferraioli, specialized in medieval books and manuscripts. Ferraioli claimed the map originated from a European library facing bankruptcy, but never disclosed its exact source. Upon Ferraioli's death in the late 1960s, Any hope of tracing the map's former ownership vanished. For cartographers, philologists, and historians, the content of the Vinland map was as problematic as its history. On the one hand, the depiction of Greenland's coastline is so precise that it raises suspicions. Although there was some knowledge of Greenland's insularity in the 15th century, there are no reasonable grounds to assume that a circumnavigation of Greenland was ever carried out during medieval times. Yet the Vinland map seems to suggest that. On the other hand, the Latinized forms of Scandinavian names were likely written by someone unfamiliar with Scandinavian patronymics and their Latinization. For example, on the map, Leif Eriksson's name is rendered as Leifus Erissonius instead of Leifus Erici. Another controversial point is the portrayal of Bjarni and Leif as companions, when the sources clearly state that they two reached Vinland at different times and through separate expeditions. According to Kristen Siever, since the only account that places Bjarni and Leif on the same ship was published in 1765, the creation of the Vinland map must have occurred after this date. So this raises further doubts about its purported medieval origin. Meanwhile, in response to the growing skepticism, Yale University decided to subject the Vinland map to a series of tests to clarify the issue of its authenticity. To this end, the university enlisted a team from Walter McCrone Associates in Chicago to conduct a detailed analysis of the map's ink. The McCrone report, published in 1974, appeared to leave no room for doubt. The map was a modern forgery. The McCrone team reached this conclusion after discovering that the ink used for the map differed from the ink used for the Storia d'Artarorum and the Speculum Historiale. Specifically, the ink on the map contained high concentrations of anatase, a mineral form of titanium dioxide, which is rare in nature but has been produced artificially in pure form since 1920. Based on this, the McCrone team concluded that the Vinland map was a deliberate fraud. Yale University had no choice to acknowledge this conclusion, and on January 27, 1974, it issued a press release admitting that, based on recent analysis, the famous Vinland map may be a forgery. Despite the Yale's retraction, a portion of the scientific community continued to consider the Vinland map authentic, raising concerns about the accuracy and validity of McCrone's analysis. As a result, in 1985, Yale decided to conduct a second test, a second examination of the codex, of the entire codex, the map, the Storia Tartarorum, and the Speculum Historiale. This time entrusting the investigation to the team of Dr. Thomas Cahill from the University of California. The tests yielded the results that were completely at odds with those of McCrone. Although the inks used for the map and the inks used for the other two works were different, the amount of anatase found in both the parchment and the ink was not higher than what had been found in other medieval manuscripts. So this could no longer be considered a reliable indicator of the map's production date. However, Cahill's study, published in 1987, was also unable to conclusively prove the map's authenticity. At this point, the debate had reached a stalemate situation, with two scientific teams taking opposing positions, neither able to definitively resolve the enigma of the villain map. In 1988, therefore, Macron reaffirmed its stance that the map was a forgery made after 1920, fueled by the publication of a second edition, the Villain Map and the Tartar Relation in 1995. The debate between those who consider the map authentic and those who believe it to be a forgery continued for decades. Most cartographers, philologists, historians lean toward the theory of a modern forgery. For example, in 2004, Kirsten Sieve suggested as responsible for the fraud a German geographer, Father Joseph Fischer, who was an expert in 15th century maps and the author of a book on Scandinavians in America, published at the beginning of the 20th century. According to Siever, under the Nazi regime, Fischer stumbled upon the Tartar relation and decided to create a companion map designed to confuse the future Nazi scholars by demonstrating the global reach of Roman missionaries. After Fischer's death in Siever reconstruction, the map eventually reached Ferraioli, who erased all markings that could trace back to the previous owner. While both theories are plausible, while this theory is plausible, neither has been proved beyond doubt. Another theory was proposed in 1997 by the historian Lars Lönnroth, who offered an explanation based on tests conducted by the Brookhaven National Laboratory. These tests appeared to suggest that the ink used to draw the section of the map related to Vinland was different from the ink used for the rest of the map. On this basis, Lönnroth hypothesized that the islands of Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland might have been added later, possibly centuries after, to an authentic medieval map that accompanied the Tartar relation. But the final words in the Villain Map controversy arrived in 2018, when John Paul Floyd, an independent Scottish researcher, in his book A Sorry Saga, announced that he had identified the provenance of both the Speculum and the Tartar relation manuscripts in the catalogue of the Exposition Historico-Europea, an exhibition mounted in Madrid in 1892-1893 to celebrate the quarter-centenary of Columbus' first voyage. This is clearly the volume containing the Yale manuscripts, and yet there is no mention of the map. The catalogue explains that the volume was lent by the Archdiocese of Saragossa, and we know that the Archiepiscopal Library is the library in Saragossa Cathedral from which Enzo Ferraioli was convicted of stealing books. So Ferraioli may have stolen the Yale volume himself, or he may have been fencing the volume on behalf of another thief. And the volume was presumably stolen before 1954, when the medieval codices in the library were photographed. It is reasonable to conclude that in 1892 the volume did not include the map, though it may have included the parchment on which the map was later drawn. It would seem that the Yale volume had been in Saragossa Cathedral for a very long time, until it was stolen in the early 1950s. Blank parchment from the volume was subsequently used to draw the Villain Map, but the identity of the forger remained mysterious. So, while the manuscript can be dated to the first half of the 15th century, the map is clearly a modern forgery. So I'm going to conclude. Over the course of about 2 centuries, the stories of Viking explorations in North America, which took place around the year 1000, but were recounted more than 200 years later in the Icelandic sagas, has undergone multiple shifts in status. Initially, many viewed it with skepticism, almost akin to a fake news story, because it was not supported by concrete evidence. However, between the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, it gained new momentum through what Michael Miklovich in 1990 called the folk archaeology, a form of archaeology conducted by non-experts who approach the past without following professional standards. These individuals are often driven by religious zeal, ignorance, racism, malice, or by economic, social, ideological, and emotional factors. This category includes the reports of alleged Viking artifacts discovered in the United States. The two main traditions arising around North America are the New England tradition and the Midwest tradition, which share common elements. Both are rooted in the romanticized Viking myth, driven by political, ideological, social, and cultural factors. They serve as an identity building function with racial implications, distinguishing the Anglo-Americans initially and later the Scandinavian Americans from other European immigrants. These narratives were instrumental in legitimizing the white and Christian expansion and conquest at the expense of the Native Americans. They tended to attribute Native American artifacts to the North, thus depriving the indigenous peoples of their connection to their ancestors, the lands, and their own past. Despite repeated debunking by scientists and experts across various disciplines, there is still a significant number of enthusiasts with no training in linguistics, but who wish to people America's past with Viking hordes, as Eric Wolgen wrote. To understand this persistent attachment to the Viking myth, we must recognize that belief in an idea, especially an idea concerning one's own past, rarely depends solely from its authenticity or falsity. Instead, it is deeply influenced by the social and cultural background of the believers, which predisposes them to hold on to such ideas, even in the face of contradictory evidence. In the case of the United States, and the Midwest in particular, this background is shaped by a large Scandinavian American community, proud of its heritage, where the Viking myth took root and flourished. In Minnesota especially, Scandinavian immigrants had settled during the second half of the 19th century and had to fight hard for acceptance within the local community. For them, the discovery of the Kensington stone in 1898 was seen as a sign that their ancestors had arrived in the region before the English Puritans, and that Minnesota was their promised land. Through that stone and the narrative connected to it, Scandinavian immigrants laid claim to their share in American history, a history in which they sought full integration. Fueled by ideological factors and the great allure of the Viking myth, the story of the Norwegians of Kensington in Minnesota has thus been transformed into a kind of civic religion, aimed at legitimizing the white and Christian conquest of the frontier. At the same time, believing the Viking presence has become a regional business, appropriated by local institutions, civic associations, and even churches, both Catholic, such as the Church of Our Lady of the Runestone in Kensington, and Protestant. In fact, Catholic historians and clergy were immediately pleased with the religious fervor and devotion to Mary shown by the medieval rune carver of Kensington, who, along with the supposed round church of Newport, demonstrated that it was the Catholics and not Lutherans who were the first European to set foot in America. So these are two images of this Viking identity of the Minnesota state today. The Minnesota Vikings above and below the Church of Our Lady of the Runestones in Kensington. So ultimately, thanks to the Kensington runestone and the story invented by Holland, the state of Minnesota has effectively created its own Viking identity, expressed, for example, by the Minnesota Vikings and the football team based in Minneapolis. The heart of this identity is the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, the county seat of Douglas County, where the Kensington stone is still on display, alongside the miniature reproduction for sale, and where a huge statue of a Viking, affectionately called Big Ole by the locals, stands proudly. On his shield is inscribed the phrase, Alexandria, birthplace of America. In short, according to this view, America was born when the Europeans arrived, and the first to arrive were the Vikings in Minnesota. For different reasons, the artifacts from Lanza Meadows, the main penny, and the villa map appear not to have been affected by the ideological use of the Viking myth. In the case of Lanza Meadows, the absence of elements that could ignite popular enthusiasm, such as artifacts linked to Christian religious practice, or the lack of a socially and culturally receptive local context, played a decisive role in preventing any potential ethnic or communal claims from arising. Above all, Lanza Meadows is in Canada, not in the United States, so it could not be used to corroborate any local identity theories. Similarly, although the main penny is unquestionably authentic, it was not correctly identified until 1978, when the authenticity of the Scandinavian voyages to America had really and definitively been proven by the excavation at Lanza Meadows. And the academic debate on the subject had lost much of its polemical fervor. Finally, the villa map, despite being discovered at a time when the debates about Scandinavian voyages were still alive, the map was found in Europe, not in America, and therefore lacked any direct territorial connection to the United States. Ideologically, it was primarily used as an anti-Columbian argument aimed at diminishing Columbus' achievements, but it did not become a focal point for identity issues related to the myth of America's Viking roots. So, thank you very much for your attention and for your patience. And here is a short list of bibliography on the subject. Thank you.
Hello, Francesco.
Hello.
Hello, thank you so much. It was great to hear you. It was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you again. for your...
We have some questions to you, okay?
Yeah, okay.
The first question is by Dr. Luciana de Campos, and she says, Victorian poets and visual artists were inspired by the sagas and Norse mythology to create their works. Did these artists also draw inspiration from all the historical and archaeological evidence of their time?
The Victorian artists, yes, they were inspired by the medieval period as a whole, not only by the Viking Age or the Viking Scandinavia or Norse mythology. It was all the medieval period that inspired the Victorian artists, poets, writers. We may, for example, think about Sir Ivan Scott and the book Ivanhoe. It was the Middle Ages that inspired the romantic artists and poets and writers, not only the Viking Age and the story of medieval Scandinavia. So yes, the answer is yes. They were inspired by, for example, by the story of the Crusades, as I say in the book of Ivanhoe. We could say the medieval period was a source of inspiration for these artists and these intellectuals.
Yes, I loved that you put in your slide some romantic paints and some movie scenes of movie Vikings, and we can see the difference of the artistic receptions, the movies and the 19th century paintings. We have it's not a question, it's some little words from Dr. Johnny Langer. He says, thank you, Francesco. The conference was excellent. Brazil also had theories about the Viking presence here. In the 1830s, Karl Harfn established correspondence with Peter Land, who lived in Minas Gerais. Both believed that the Norse had been in Bahia, and this was confirmed at the time by Brazilian historians. At the end of the 19th century, they were called the Sons of Odin, and some claimed that they had also been in the Amazon. Even today, some still believe this. The main difference is that Brazil did not have Scandinavian communities to reinforce this identity, and over time, the theory disappeared from Brazilian academy. And Johnny have the question. Have you looked at the wonderful tapestry, The Skeleton in Armor by Walter Crane, which is the Musée des Beaux-Arts, Rouen. It was based on Henry Longfellow and is one of the many visual sources of Viking myth in the United States. There is also splendid stained glass windows at the Vinland State, Newport, by Edward Burne-Jones.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you. I wish to thank Johnny for his comments. I did not know this story of the Brazilian Vikings. I think is really interesting to compare this tradition to the North American tradition about the Viking presence in the West. As for the tapestry, No, I did not look at this tapestry, but as I said in my presentation, the work of Longfellow was fundamental for the spreading of this imagine of the Vikings in the New England, and to routing of the Viking presence in the New England states. So I will take a look at the tapestry as soon as I can to examine it, to link it with the issue of the Norseman presence in North America. So thank you again.
Thank you. I was at the Independence Party of Norway in the year 2019 in Oslo, the 17th of May. And I saw some videos of the same party in Seattle. And they have the same joy, the same traditional clothes. And we see in this that in America they have a very proud and beautiful Nordic culture. It's very, very beautiful.
Yeah, besides all the political or ideological implications and which I dealt before, yeah, in the United States there is still a numerous community of Scandinavian origin, and they were still proud of their heritage, as they call it. It's really an heritage they feel as their own.
Yes, thank you so much for your presence, for your conference. We learned a lot with you. And now I have to finish the session, but before we close this live, we will be grateful if you stay with us 1 more minute for a little chat. Is it okay?
Of course,
okay.
Of course.
Thank you so much, Francesco. And we'll be back at 3 p.m. in Brasilia with the conference From Emporium to Civitas in Southern Scandinavia by the Professor Morten Schuss, em português. Nós voltamos em breve às 3 da tarde do Brasil para a conferência From Emporium to Civitas in Southern Scandinavia com o professor Morten Schuss. Muito obrigada a todos e até breve. Thank you, Dr. Francesco D'Angelo.
Thank you very much again for the invitation.